Dracula arrives in England on a ship called the Demeter, which runs aground at Whitby with its entire crew dead and a large black dog bounding ashore. The newspapers cover it. The ship's log is recovered. A lunatic asylum patient who has been eating flies and spiders begins to agitate. A solicitor's fiancée starts sleepwalking toward the cliffs. And behind all of it, methodically, a Count from Transylvania is putting himself into position. The novel most people carry around in their heads is organized around the vampire, the seduction, the fangs, the Gothic castle, the cape, and the erotic threat to respectable women. Bela Lugosi in 1931 built the image that hundreds of screen adaptations have reproduced. The story goes, an ancient evil arrives, a small group of heroes assembles to destroy it, they succeed, and the threat is expelled. There is something reassuring in that structure. However, there is also something completely at odds with what Stoker wrote. Stoker's novel is an institutional autopsy. It traces how every structure Victorian England trusted to manage threats, medicine, law, journalism, and even the church, encounters something that it has no framework to categorize, and fails to contain it. Dracula's threat is that he understands how those institutions work and has planned his infiltration around their systematic blind spots. The next 15 minutes are about what those institutions do when they encounter Dracula, how the seductive monster reading eclipsed the invasion autopsy reading, and why the question Stoker was posing is the question every institutional crisis eventually becomes. And hey, if this kind of structural reading is what you're here for, subscribe. This is a full series, and each episode builds on the last. F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu in 1922, made without Stoker's permission, which is why the vampire is called Orlok rather than Dracula, kept the geography of the novel, the Transylvanian castle, the ship, and the English seaside town, but it stripped out the institutional structure and replaced it with a single, sustained horror. Nosferatu as a film is about contagion and body horror. The institutional argument is absent. Todd Browning's 1931 Dracula gave Bela Lugosi the role he'd already played on stage for years, and Lugosi in turn brought something Murnau's grotesque did not have: charisma. The formal evening wear, the accent, and the hypnotic eyes. The reading that all consolidated was that the vampire was a seductive aristocrat, a creature with enough cultural sophistication to move among the English upper classes before being recognized and destroyed. This is the version that shaped the genre. Every subsequent adaptation, Hammer horror through Christopher Lee, the Coppola film, the television series, the comedy, the parodies, is all in dialogue with Lugosi's Dracula and not Stoker's novel. Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 version is the most explicit about the seduction reading. The film literally gives Dracula a romantic backstory, a lost medieval love reincarnated in Mina, and a tragedy of separated souls finally reunited. Coppola's Dracula is a lover, not an invader. The film is gorgeous, and makes an argument that Stoker's text does not contain. What every version shares is the organization of the story around Dracula himself. The institutional failures are invisible. The women's deaths are atmospheric. The epistolary structure, the interlocking diaries and letters and newspaper clippings that constitute Stoker's actual novel, is collapsed into visual storytelling that treats the documents as scene-setting props, rather than as the novel's argument. They are adapting the villain, but the villain is not the novel's subject. Dracula, as a novel, is almost entirely constructed from documents. We have Jonathan Harker's journal, Mina Murray's diary, Dr. Seward's phonographic diary, Lucy Westerna's letters, Van Helsing's memoranda, newspaper clippings, a ship's log. There is no omniscient narrator to tell us what is happening. We assemble the story from the documents written by people who, for most of the novel, do not have enough information to understand what is happening to them. And that structure is the novel's formal argument. Information exists inside these documents. The pattern is visible from the outside to us, the readers, but is not accessible to the characters because they are working inside their own professional framework, and their frameworks prevent them from seeing what falls outside of them. Speaking of journals, let's return to Jonathan Harker's, which opens the novel. Jonathan is a solicitor's clerk traveling to Transylvania to close a real estate transaction. His journal of the journey is a record of progressive unease. We see the strange customs and crucifixes pressed on him by strangers, the wolves, the castle, and even the Count's behavior, organized entirely by the framework of a man trying to complete a business transaction. He is not equipped in any way to categorize what he's encountering. He has no conceptual framework that admits it. His journal is a document of institutional blindness, a careful, intelligent, professionally competent man recording with precision exactly what he cannot understand. Dr. Seward runs an asylum adjacent to the property Dracula purchases in England. He's a clinical alienist, what we would call a psychiatrist, and his photographic diary is a record of his professional response to Renfield, his patient who eats living creatures and agitates at intervals that correspond, we later understand, to Dracula's movements. Seward's framework is clinical. He categorizes, observes, he speculates about pathology. He cannot arrive at the correct explanation. His diary is his best professional effort applied to something his profession cannot properly understand. Van Helsing is the novel's expert, the man who eventually understands what they are facing. He knows about vampires not because of private supernatural knowledge, but because he has read across multiple disciplinary fields and assembled the pattern from them. What Van Helsing is doing is exactly what the novel is doing, assembling what no single professional discipline could see from the inside. Underneath all of these runs the invasion structure. Dracula has been planning the English infiltration for years, learning English, studying the customs, arranging transport, even distributing boxes of Transylvanian earth at multiple London locations before the characters understand what they contain. He is settling England systematically, moving through its institutional architecture at exactly the points those institutions have not prepared to defend. The written structure of the novel does not adapt to cinema without losing the argument. The novel's central claim is not merely that Dracula is frightening. We see that the institutions, charged with managing threats like Dracula, cannot see him coming because they can only categorize what their frameworks include. That claim is built into the form. Each document is a record of a professional failing. When cinema, by necessity, collapses these documents into visual storytelling with an omniscient camera, the argument dissolves. We see what's happening. Every character's failure looks like ignorance or stupidity rather than structural limitation. We are watching from outside the frameworks, and the frameworks no longer work. The distributed nature of the horror compounds this. Dracula does not have a dramatic confrontation until very late in the novel. He operates through vectors. We see the boxes, the bats, the corrupted women, the controlled lunatic. The horror is systemic, but cinema wants scenes. Lucy Westenra's deterioration is the novel's most difficult adaptation problem. She is drained across weeks while the men call different doctors, conduct blood transfusions, and write reports to one another. Her death, beyond being a tragic accident, is the measured consequence of professionally qualified people failing systematically. Stoker wrote this in particular as an institutional indictment. Let's be clear, the romantic vampire tradition predates Stoker by decades. Polidori's The Vampire in 1819 gave the vampire its aristocratic glamour, a cold, predatory nobleman using his social position to victimize those around him. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla in 1872 gave the vampire its erotic charge. By the time Stoker was writing in the 1890s, the vampire was already a saturated cultural figure with an established set of meanings, and the seductive reading was available and waiting before Dracula was published. And now we move on to what this costs. The invasion reading, the argument that the novel is about what Victorian institutions cannot see, requires attention to the documents themselves, their sequence, their failures, and their patterns of omission. It is a less immediately resonant reading because it asks us to think about bureaucratic and professional structures rather than about desire and transgression. The reading that resonates gets taught. The reading that gets taught becomes what the text is about, and so the autopsy gets filed as a horror story. Channel memberships are open. Members get early access, exclusive essays, and a backlog of 100+ older videos. The Demeter's log ends mid-entry. The last legible words are, "God have mercy." The crew is gone. The ship runs itself aground. A large black dog bounds ashore and disappears into town. Dracula arrived and no one saw him coming. Competence organized by the wrong framework produces exactly what Stoker shows us. Careful, detailed, professionally excellent records of a failure in progress, made by people doing their best with the categories they had. Lucy is dead, but she didn't have to be. The window of intervention was long, and the people around her were genuinely trying. They just couldn't understand what was happening. And so we see with that the vampire was the mechanism, and the frameworks were the argument. The last episode examined Frankenstein and the question of what creation obligates, what a maker owes the conscious thing they bring into the world, and what happens when the obligation is refused. That episode is linked here. Subscribe to keep up with the series. Next episode is Jekyll and Hyde and the mechanism Stevenson built that every adaptation has gotten wrong. Thanks for watching, and stay copacetic.